Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Ron from. We are just waiting for other people to log in. We will start at exactly 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So, if you guys can hear me, for all the participants, just please type in yes in the chat box just to make sure that everyone can hear me. Thank you. All right, so we still have 10 minutes. Just please stay with us and we will start the webinar at exactly 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We already have our speaker on the other line, but let's just wait for the other participants to log in. So for the meantime, so you won't hear any voice while we are waiting for the participants. Thank you so much. Again, if those other people or other participants can hear me, just please type in yes in the chat box. All right. Thank you. Thank you for the response. So I'll get back to you a few minutes before 1 p.m. so that we can I can introduce and start we can start the webinar. Thank you. Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Ron from International Trade Council. So, in 3 minutes' time, we will start the webinar. And when the presenter starts, we will just let other participants to log in because the schedule is 1 p.m. So, we will start in 3 minutes' time. Thank you. All right. Good afternoon again. My name is Ron from International Trade Council. So I will be the one of the presenter for this webinar. I will be the modulator. Again, this webinar is about remedies 2019. What businesses should know. And we have Nithya Nagarahan from Hash Blackwell LLP. She will be our presenter for today. Now, just few reminders. So basically, she will discuss the slides, and then if you have any questions, that will be addressed after the presentation. So if you already have a question in mind, you can already type the question in the chat box, and then after she presented, she will answer your question one by one. And so basically, again, if you have any further question, just please type into the chat box, and then we will answer it at the end of the presentation. So I will give the floor to Nithya. And also, while we are doing the presentation, we will just let other participants to log in. Since the time is already 1 p.m., we will start the webinar now. So I will give the floor to Miss Nithya. Go ahead, ma'am.
Hi, Ron. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and welcome to everybody who's signed in to join this webinar on trade remedies in 2019, what businesses should know. So basically, the presentation is going to cover the following trade remedy actions that the U.S. has used in order to address concerns with imports into the United States. There are, of course, the traditional anti-dumping and countervailing duty trade remedies. We're also going to discuss what Section 337 actions are. The Section 232 aluminum and steel tariffs that have been in place for now a year and approximately 1 month. The Section 301 trade actions, and some of the enforcement concerns that the U.S. is dealing with, and especially what U.S. Customs is dealing with. So first, the traditional trade remedies. These are categorized as two things. It's known as dumping and countervailing subsidies. Dumping is effectively when a company sells an export market, it sells in the export market, and here we're going to discuss the United States. It's going to sell in the United States for a price less than what they sell the same product in their home market. And the difference between those two prices is what is known as dumping. Countervailable subsidies are also actionable under US law and the WTO if it is and subsidies are a financial contribution given by a foreign government to an entity in order to enable it to either produce or export more goods and gain market share in a foreign marketplace. Now, both investigations are very unique and complex, and they have numerous data reporting requirements, tight deadlines, and especially in the United States, it involves an on-site visit by the US government officials to verify and cross-check that almost a 8-9 month year-long period of data collection. Now, defense of an anti-dumping or countervailing duty trade action is multifaceted because in the US market you have two different agencies which are dealing with and are concerned with different aspects of this type of trade remedy. One is the Department of Commerce that does the actual margin calculation, and the second agency is the International Trade Commission, which reviews and examines whether or not the US domestic industry is being injured. Countervailing duty actions are also similar in intensity because it requires a foreign respondent to provide full information on all the benefits it has received from its government and all of its sales values, such that an analysis can be done as to whether or not there is actual subsidization. Now, CVD cases are country specific, but it is really important for the manufacturers who are named as the mandatory respondents to fully participate. Now, you might wonder, okay, why is this important? Well, in the last year, okay, just after the Trump administration has taken office, the number of anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases has jumped year on year. In the first quarter of 2019, we have 20% more cases than we had in the last year of the Obama administration. However, while this number may be down in 2019, we have to take into account the almost all of January was lost because of the well-publicized government shutdown. So the first quarter results are not that clear in 2019, but definitely over the last 3 years, we've seen a significant uptick. In 2018, we had a slight decline because many US manufacturers were dealing with the Section 232 and 301 trade remedies that kind of had a depressive effect on the number of anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases filed, but it's still an important concern. Now, what are the main targets? Well, the biggest target still and continues to be iron and steel products. There are 143 cases, orders out there on steel products, and together there are about 482 active AD and CVD orders currently put forth by the US government. Now, the country with the biggest number of cases is, of course, China, followed by India at 43. Then you have Korea or Taiwan with 27, Korea with 34, and as it goes down the list, it will keep, the numbers go down. So you can see this area of Asia has the highest number of anti-dumping duty and countervailing duty orders against it. And that's an important point to note because as trade patterns shift, as economies grow, the individual numbers may change and there might be a shift from, say, China cases to maybe India or Thailand or Indonesia, you're still going to have a majority of the cases coming from this region of the world. So how are AD and CVD cases filed? Well, it's an action brought by a U.S. domestic interested party, and they physically file a petition for relief with the Department of Commerce and the U.S. International Trade Commission. One of the key factors is generally they have to have, whoever's bringing the petition has to have at least 25% of support of those manufacturers producing the product against which they are seeking relief, and also another 50% of other entities that may not produce the exact product but have an interest in that product, such that together they have about 75% of the domestic industry supporting the petition. And the U.S. statute is very clear in that there are certain benchmarks that must be met in order for a petition to succeed. And once these include, conditions of the U.S. market, concrete evidence of dumping or subsidization, a specific description of a very precise product. Once these factors are met, the Department of Commerce will initiate an anti-dumping and/or countervailing duty investigation. It's important to note that anti-dumping cases are generally can be filed alone, but if you're going to file a countervailing duty investigation, it's always coupled and filed jointly with an anti-dumping duty investigation. Now, countervailing duties, we briefly discussed that they are, in fact, an analysis of the foreign subsidies given by a foreign government. But why is that of interest? Well, government subsidies can distort the efficient allocation of economic resources by basically interfering with the price and other market conditions, such that businesses find it profitable to use these subsidizations. It can also help distort the production of goods within an economy, which is why the WTO and the US law regulate the use of subsidies in order to minimize these distortive effects. So under US law, any countervailing duties are basically the duties that are placed if it is found that there is injurious subsidization provided by foreign governments. Now you have three main authorities that the US uses. You have, of course, the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Duty Measures. The most important provision is the US statute at 19 U.S.C. 1671. And then there's also the regulations, the process and procedures, case law precedent, and administrative practice. And the U.S. is very, very careful about making their decisions comport with these two provisions. They a lot of times ignore WTO provisions, but they will follow the statute and they'll follow the regulations very closely. So what is the definition of of countervailing duty? It's a subsidy, which is a financial contribution, and these can include a direct transfer of funds, a potential such as a loan guarantee, the foregoing or non-collection of revenue, which includes like tax credits or duty forgiveness, not being required to pay import duties, or providing goods or services for less than adequate remuneration, purchasing goods for more than adequate remuneration, or giving land for less than adequate remuneration. A benefit is considered to be in existence to the extent that the subsidy recipient gets a financial or in-kind assistance on terms that are more favorable than others in the same market. And most importantly, a subsidy must be specific to a particular industry. And not all subsidies are countervailable. It's an program by program analysis, but generally export subsidies are prohibited by the WTO and are almost universally countervailed by the US government. In the U.S., the countervailing duty investigation takes basically 1 full year. So you have the petition that's filed, that's day 0. But throughout the process, there are very specific steps that must be followed up until the time that the DOC makes its final decision and an order is issued. While these are the kind of the basic statutory deadlines, which means that a case can take a minimum of about 9 months, it normally is extended, and this day 212 is actually day 365. So it's a year-long intensive investigation. Now, the periods of investigation are different. In investigation, it's the full calendar year as of the month preceding the month in which the petition is filed. And I know that sounds very confusing. So say we have March, a petition is filed. The period of investigation would be the full calendar year of 2018 because it was filed in March of 2019. In reviews, that's different because there is a staggered time period. What normally occurs is it's the most recently completed calendar year. If you're looking at, say, a review comes up in March or June, you're going to also look at a review at the full year of 2018. Now, what is really the calculation? Well, if you have a general subsidy, which is something that's given just for both domestic as well as export production and sales, you take the total value of the benefit divided by total sales, and that gives you a percentage. The export subsidy is the one that is probably the most onerous. There you take the total benefit specific to that export subsidy, and you divide that by total export sales. Now, as you can tell, a company's total sales are going to be greater than their total export sales. So by a simple function of mathematics, a general subsidy is going to get you a lower percentage, simple math, whereas an export subsidy is going to end up being higher because your denominator is smaller. For duty drawback, it's a unique system here in the US. You look at this changes case by case, but generally they try to look at total benefits on exports to the United States divided by total exports to the United States. So this is almost an export market specific analysis. It's also important to note that in an investigation, if you have a countervailing duty rate of 1% or 0, then effectively no duties are applied because it's considered de minimis. If it's over 1%, then countervailing duties are collected at the time of import and then are reviewed annually to see whether or not that subsidization continues. Now let's turn to the anti-dumping aspect, which I think is more common for everybody. In anti-dumping, again, you have the agreement on the implementation of Article 6 of GATT, 1994. You also have the U.S. statute at 19 U.S.C. 1673. And similar to CVD, or exactly like CVD, you have the regulations, the procedures, and precedent and administrative practice that governs how these cases are handled. Now, in dumping, there are specific concepts which are slightly different than countervailing duties. Of course, you have the period of investigation and period of review, which are similar. And you're also more concerned with subject merchandise because you have to report the precise sales and costs of a very, very specific product. And it's that reporting of the subject merchandise sales in the home market and the U.S. market that leads to the price comparison, which effectively generates your dumping margin calculation and what in fact is your completed margin of dumping. Now, the key difference between investigations and reviews in the dumping time period is an investigation takes a year to complete and an administrative review is 18 months. But the most important difference is the effect of the final. In an investigation, it's considered a cash deposit, but in a review, a final calculated number is both the future cash deposit as well as the retroactive liquidation rate, which makes the U.S. system in a review position both prospective and retrospective, even though it is commonly referred to as a retrospective system. But there are both prospective and retrospective aspects to this process. Similarly, the anti-dumping investigation is a year-long process, and this also, from the day the petition is filed to the day of completion, it's normally 360 to 365 days, because each of these deadlines can and will be extended. Now, what is really dumping? Well, you first have to find out whether or not there's a dumping margin, and then whether the cause of this dumping is leading to injury of the U.S. domestic industry. Well, and there are also two different agencies. The Department of Commerce handles the actual calculation, and as I said earlier, the ITC handles the injury analysis. So you have kind of two different sets of agencies, two different sets of analysts, and analytic tools used to make this determination. Now, what is really the dumping margin? It's basically the difference in normal value, which is your home market price, and the export price to generate the dumping margin. You'd think that was simple, but it's not, because each one of these elements has adjustments and revisions and differences, whereby if you are a savvy exporter or a savvy business person, you take advantage of all of these different adjustments in a way that you minimize the dumping margin. And that is a strategy that we as lawyers really spend a lot of time advising clients on, because the devil is in the details. It's not an easy calculation. It's not something that most companies are able to do on their own. But since we have been doing this now in my firm collectively, with all of us about 60, 70 years worth of experience, we help companies basically determine how best to minimize the effect of this calculation. Similar to CVD, if you have a margin, a dumping margin below 2%, then you will be considered to be de minimis and no dumping duties will apply. If it's above 2%, they will customs, and the Commerce Department will instruct customs to start collecting duties. There's also another key difference between CVD and AD is that you're talking about different levels of price. If you are a foreign producer directly U.S. unaffiliated customer, you fall under an export price calculational analysis. But if you have a U.S. agent or an affiliated reseller in the U.S., that means you fall under a constructed export price analysis. Each of these have slightly different adjustments and calculations. So again, the devil is seriously in the details on this one. We just went over, just to summarize, export price is basically the foreign producer sells the goods prior to importation, whereas a constructed export price is that the sale is made after importation. Dates of sale, that's really important on the dumping side, because that determines which universe of sales you report and also how you match sales to get to the most accurate margin. So common adjustments are you adjust for discounts and rebates and freight costs, and you also potentially have issues where you have to add to the U.S. price, which include freight revenue if they charge for freight separately, or late payment fees, because these are all additional monies that are coming to the foreign manufacturer. Constructed export price, you can see very simply that there are just more adjustments whereby you can really fine-tune the U.S. price that is being matched to the home market price in order to fine-tune that margin. Now, what is normal value? Normal value is just another term for your home market price. Here, in the home market, you have a lot more kind of big issues to deal with. One of them is affiliation, which the US government takes very seriously in their analysis. And they want to make sure that when a foreign company is functioning as a respondent, that they are reporting all of their information, which includes any affiliates that are making or selling or involved in the production or sale of the merchandise that's being investigated or reviewed. Now, there are both statutory and regulatory definitions for affiliation, and it is a case-specific analysis, but pretty much if you have corporate or family groupings, franchises or joint ventures, any debt financing or close supplier relationships, all of those have to be considered to determine which set of companies have to actively report their information. In an investigation, you want to report all home market sales with a date of sale within that 12-month period of investigation. Whereas in a review, you actually have to report 15 or 18 months of information because you have the 12-month period plus 3 months before and 2 months after. So it's, or 17 months, sorry. It's quite a voluminous amount of reporting of data to the Department of Commerce. Another consideration in your dumping analysis is whether or not you have sales in the home market which account for more than 5% of your export sales to the US. Now, why is this important? Because in many situations for certain products, there is no home market in the fact that that producer only exports their goods, which means that Commerce can't use, say, the market in which the company is located in for their analysis. They have to effectively look at 2 export markets. One is the United States, but a question remains as to which that other third country is going to be. Generally, they look at the similarity of merchandise, the sales volume, and how similar it is to the US market to select a third country. This is becoming a very common problem when you have manufacturing entities set up solely to produce and export. This is common in Vietnam. I don't want to use Vietnam or China as examples because they're both non-market economies, but this is an issue when you're talking about Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, where plants are set up purely for export and for nothing else. Also in the home market, you have to determine whether or not the sales that are being made in the comparison market are in fact above or below cost. The reason that is important is a sale is not really viable and considered to be, a proper comparison if it is sold below cost. This cost analysis and cost test is also a pretty intensive reporting requirement at the Department of Commerce because you're looking at a specific categories of products and a specific physical characteristic match to see whether or not a product-specific cost is being attributed to that sale. And then if your home market sales are on average above 80%, then we use the whole universe. If your total universe of home market sales less than 80% pass the cost test, then within each of these bands, you look at a specific product to see whether or not there is a match. So as you can see, it's not an easy analysis, and it's very information and case specific. Now, the normal value calculation also takes into account all your freight, your discounts, any selling expenses, commissions, packing, so that effectively when you are doing the comparison, it is an ex-factory to ex-factory price that is being used to compare in order to calculate the dumping margin. Now, I'm not going to get into the definition of a product because we're already about halfway through and I want to get to other stuff. But effectively, to match, what I want to kind of emphasize is that at least in the US regime, It is a very precise product-to-product match, which means that you have a pencil. The way you will match to determine whether or not there is dumping is it will be a yellow pencil with an eraser and with that, little metal tube, and it has to be the exact two products that are sold. If there are any differences, those differences will also be accounted for in the match, and if there is no similar product, then the U.S. will compare it to constructed value, which is effectively a built-up cost of production. There's also the question of, price averaging or zeroing. And here in the U.S., we still zero, in the sense that if you have negative margins, unless you can demonstrate that there is no price differences market to market or between customers in the U.S. market, it's going to end up that if you do an average, what is known as an average to transaction match, that zero price margin sales will not be considered in the final dumping analysis. And that was recently, it keeps repeatedly getting affirmed in various court decisions. Now, we've gone over the margin calculation in several different forms, including the deductions and the offsets. So in effect, the basic concept is that it's going to be the unit margin is the normal value minus net US price on a transaction-specific basis. And this, multiplied by the sales quantities, is what generates the dumping margin for a particular company at the conclusion of a dumping investigation or a dumping review. Now, you're going to wonder why all of this was so important. Well, it's because in the US we have very intensive questionnaires. The AD questionnaire, anti-dumping questionnaire, contains 5 different parts. So cumulatively, the questionnaire itself is over 180 pages. With the CVD, you also have the government that has to respond, as well as individual producers, exporters. And cumulatively, this questionnaire is about 100 pages. And the intensity of the questionnaires is very specific. In the AD anti-dumping questionnaire, you need to report your corporate structures, your date of sale, your sales processes, your accounting processes, your financial statements. Everything has to be reported. Same with this home market sales. You need to report any intercompany sales, affiliated sales. So you can see just through this listing on this slide how intensive the requirement is. And it's normally the sales and accounting teams of an individual company that are going to be tasked with preparing this. And it takes about 4 to 6 weeks for the raw data to be collected and compiled. And then, as counsel, it takes us 2 to 3 weeks to then consolidate all that information and file a submission. So you're talking about an average of about a 10-week information gathering phase for the entire anti-dumping duty questionnaire and all, basically all 5 parts. Same is true with the CVD questionnaire. There, you better have your foreign government actively participate. Otherwise, no matter what the individual company does in the Section 3, reporting of its sales values, benefits, etc., it effectively pays the price because the government is non-responsive. And this is also, again, a 2 to 3 week information gathering exercise for the companies on site with their data and information. Now, in a CVD case, where companies mess up is determining where and how to report certain sales values. The normal instinct is to say, okay, I'm only going to report the sales of the merchandise, that the product that the U.S. is investigating. Well, that's not necessarily going to help you, because that's probably going to be the smallest denominator. And it is a basic requirement under the U.S. system that you have to look at total consolidated sales of the at the highest level of financial consolidation as your denominator for general benefits and general subsidies. And then you look at total exports, including exports to all countries for export subsidies. And as I mentioned earlier, it's only for duty drawback that it becomes a specific U.S. export analysis. And in the same side for benefits, it's better to be over-inclusive than under-inclusive. And a key problem in CVD cases is that foreign governments are generally found to be not cooperative because they don't provide sufficient information. So in the event you have a case that's brought, you as a company, as an exporter, or as a respondent, it's very important to work very closely with that country's foreign government. And just like anything else, the success or failure in this is really preparation. And preparation helps in getting into the detailed requirements for the information requests, because poor responses effectively burden management and staff because you keep getting supplemental questionnaires from the Department of Commerce. The most important effect of this, however, is that the failure to respond and provide accurate information leads to what is known as an adverse facts available or adverse assumption. And this is usually the highest rate in the petition. So if you had properly reported your information, you could have gotten a margin of, say, less than 2% or maybe 2 to 4%. Failure to respond can lead to sometimes triple-digit 100, 200, 300% margins. A recent case in large diameter welded pipe from India resulted in just that. The companies decided to go it on their own and they just didn't participate. The petition had alleged a margin of about 20% for countervailing duties, but due to non-cooperation and non-participation in the end, the companies got 542% as their CVD margin simply because they chose not to take the avail of counsel's assistance in preparing this, and they just couldn't handle the burden associated with these information requests. So I'm going to skip over the next two slides and go over to other matters that are handled in conjunction with anti-dumping and countervailing duties. And these are what are known as scope rulings or new shipper reviews. If you're caught up in a case or a matter that has a dumping order on it, all is not lost. There are two different options that can be used after an order is instituted to see whether or not you have to actually bear dumping duties or countervailing duties at the time of importation. One is a scope ruling, which is basically you can ask, because the Department of Commerce is the ultimate authority that sets the scope of these cases. Scope meaning which products are covered or which are not. Many companies choose to go this route and ask for a scope ruling so they can get their product excluded. Scope rulings generally take about a year, sometimes about 15 to 18 months. But in the end, if it's done correctly, you might be able to carve out your product in such a manner that you're not subject to anti-dumping or countervailing duties. And this is something that we personally help a lot of clients with, because if you have a new product or a different product, it's worth exploring this option. The other option is what is known as new shipper reviews, which means that you're a brand new company, but lo and behold, you realize that there are dumping duties on the product that you are planning on exporting. You had never existed at the time that the department originally investigated the case. That doesn't mean that you can't ever get out of it. There is a provision where you effectively proactively ask for a review such that you can get your merchandise examined and you can effectively have a company-specific rate calculated for you. Now, the trick here with new shipper reviews is that because you're planning for it and you're not surprised for it, you can price your home market sales, you can price your U.S. sales, and account for your costs in such a manner that you can actually generate a 0% margin if done correctly. The same is true with the CVD. Since you know in advance that you want to ask for a new shipper review, you could plan it out that you don't avail of any benefits that the government is offering for the production, and therefore you can generate and come up with a CVD margin of 0 in advance before you file the request. And this is a great tool for companies because it can be tailored very specifically to that company's needs, provided that they meet this general requirement that they did not produce or were not affiliated with anyone who exported to the United States during the original period of investigation. Now, what are some hot topics right now in the litigation? Well, one is this new provision in effect since 2015 called Particular Market Situation, which basically gives Commerce the authority to look at extraneous influences on production costs and or supply chain situation to see whether there's an outside influence that creates an odd situation such that they cannot rely on the costs or the sales of the company that is part of the investigation. This is so new and so recent that it's still being litigated. But generally what's happened is there's a, Commerce is using this to get higher and higher dumping margins, but the court in January of this year recently said that this authority is curtailed. That ruling is not final, which is why it's not in the slide, but it's definitely something to follow and look at and see how it develops. Like I was talking about, scope rulings have become more and more important, and Commerce has, become very rigorous in its enforcement. But again, the courts are being mindful of that and slowly curtailing how expansive Commerce can view the interpretation of these scope matters. So that's also an interesting topic to keep following. And later developed merchandise, which is also an interesting angle in that now they're saying basically if you produce a downstream product from product A, product C can now be pulled into the scope because it's later developed, wasn't originally envisioned. So these are some topics to watch and be mindful of going if you have a situation where your subject or your product is subject to anti-dumping or countervailing duties. The next topic I'd like to go through is Section 337. What is 337 is handled by the International Trade Commission. It is a, let's go to the next slide, sorry. The ITC is important in this because it is a decision that is solely in the authority of the ITC. There's no other agency that makes this determination for a 337 case. A 337 case is basically a general quote-unquote unfair trade remedy. It does not necessarily have to be linked to intellectual property violations, but it is a provision of the US statute that if you can't go the traditional anti-dumping and countervailing duty route, this might be another option to be able to see whether or not you can block imports coming in of a particular product. And the thing here is that the 337 matters are handled by career administrative law judges and career staff. So some of the political twists and turns that are at issue at the other matters are not there for 337 cases. So what is a Section 337 case? Well, it can be an infringement case, which covers patents, trademarks, and copyrights. It could be what is known as a Lanham Act claim, which deals with false advertising. It could be a misappropriation of a trade secret, or it could be this catch-all category of any other unfair competition. Could be an origin issue, could be an antitrust, anti-competitive issue. So as you can see, this is a much broader scope than anti-dumping and countervailing duties. So it is one of the tools in the arsenal to see how to handle an influx of imports into the U.S. Now, the elements of a 337 is that the product has to be imported into the United States, and it has for infringement allegation, there has to be a valid U.S. intellectual property claim or other, infringement of that action, including this very broad term of unfairness. And this case is, again, brought by a domestic industry, which is the complainant or a complainant's licensee. So there's a very precise definition as to who can bring a 337 action. So what are some of the remedies with this? Well, one of the remedies is that you can get a general exclusion order, which means that the foreign manufacturer can never pretty much bring its product into the United States. So this is a fairly broad and wide-reaching remedy. Or you could get a limited exclusion order, which means that only certain aspects or certain variations of a product can be blocked. Or it can be a cease and desist order, which basically says, okay, you can't sell anything more at all from inventory or anything. So for a company that is dealing with an influx of imports, this becomes a very kind of a fast and quick tool for them. So I'm not going to get into the domestic industry, but I do want to get into the timeline of a 337 matter. As you can see, from start to finish, it's about 18 months. And that's very fast paced because this is more like real litigation. Whereas anti-dumping and countervailing duties are more of an administrative process, here you're in traditional litigation mode with discovery and document requests and document production requirements. So an 18-month timeline is a very short timeline for this type of litigation that gives a very strong hope of relief at the end of the case. Now, defending an action, it's, again, speed is of essence. The earlier you get into the defense, the more likely you have of succeeding. If you are joining the case at the end, you've probably lost a lot of opportunities to raise the argument and actively ensure that no adverse assumptions are made. And more and more, it's an issue because the U.S. industries and the U.S. government are using all of these actions to help prevent foreign companies and foreign manufacturers from exporting to the U.S. And who implements these orders? They're basically U.S. and Border Protection, U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Whether it's anti-dumping duties or whether it's 337, it's the Customs Service that actually implements all of these U.S. government decisions. Some hot topics here. You've got, a lot of cases where, complaints were dismissed because they didn't properly plead the issues. And recently in Suprema versus the ITC, the Federal Circuit held that the ITC has the authority to base a violation on imported articles, even though they're tangentially related to the infringement. Pardon me while I take a sip of water. So because of the increased use of these type of litigation modes, we're getting more and more court cases and more decisions that are, competing with some of the traditional aspects of the implementation of 337. Now let's shift to what I'm sure is everybody's favorite topic, 232, which is that, the steel and aluminum tariffs. So what makes this different than all the other trade remedies? Well, both Section 232 and Section 301, which I'll be talking about shortly, are government-instituted trade remedies. They are effectively self-initiated because there was no domestic industry that brought the case, and there was no required showing of some sort of trade-related unfairness. It was basically a unilateral action. And as everyone knows, or should know, there's 25% duties on importations of certain steel products and 10% on aluminum products. And these tariffs have been in place since last year, March 23rd of 2018. A few countries got exemptions from these duties. They were Argentina, Australia, Brazil, and South Korea. Currently, as of April of last year, India, the EU, China, and Russia are all challenging the 232 action at the WTO, but no decision has come forth because it was just 2 months ago in January that a panel was put together, and the dispute settlement body assembled a panel who will start examining the extent to which these Section 232 duties potentially violated the WTO agreement and the safeguards agreement. At the time these tariffs were instituted, there was a ability to have certain product exclusions requested. We'll get to that briefly, but effectively what's happening is these exclusions have been very, very long in terms of a process. They had anticipated 90 days to review and then issue the exclusions, but it's taking much longer. And it's also, there are more denials than there are grants of exclusions. So in the long term, it's not helping the U.S. Importer base that requires all of these imported raw materials to manufacture downstream products in the U.S. Currently, there's also a bill proposed in Congress to potentially limit or overrule the president's authority on future 232 actions, but that hasn't gotten any further, even though there's been a new Congress in place since January. So what's included in here? Well, there's certain very specific HTS numbers for steel products and certain very specific HTS numbers for aluminum products. And what's really important is if you are an importer or you are an exporter, you should pay attention to which HTS number you're bringing your products in on, because that's going to be critical to whether or not your product's going to have these additional 25% or additional 10% duties. So what are the real effects right now of these 232 tariffs on the U.S.? Well, the trade deficit has increased. The average price of steel per ton has increased as a result of these tariffs. There are retaliatory tariffs by the major trading partners, including Canada and Mexico. And it also contributed to almost a $650 million decline in American steel exports. However, on the contrary, the imports from Canada and Mexico are still continuing to increase because of the fact that they are deeply integrated into the U.S. supply chain. So effectively, the tariffs have only increased the cost for the producers who use imported steel and aluminum, and ultimately the U.S. consumer. And the tariffs also had a minimal or negligible impact on Chinese imports because steel from China is already subject to 28 separate different dumping and CVD orders. The 232 tariffs did reduce imports from Turkey, Russia, and South Korea, and that's only because, Turkey, because they have double the duties. They actually have 50% duties instituted as of August of last year. Russia, their production is generally in a state of flux, and South Korea negotiated a quota. So, I mean, it's an interconnected reason for that decline, and it's not necessarily due solely to 232 tariffs alone. But effectively, the 232 tariffs had a net economic loss for the U.S. Now, what are some of the key things you have to consider if you are facing 232 duties? Well, one of the things you want to do is see whether or not your tariff classification for your product is in fact correct. If you feel there is a question, you can ask for a binding ruling request from Customs. You can file a protest with Customs, and you can seek expert advice, both or from a broker, from a law firm, or other expert to make sure that your classification is correct. You can also file the exclusion request, as we discussed earlier, with the Commerce Department. But keep in mind that the exclusion that you obtain from the Commerce Department is valid only for 1 year. And it's definitely going to take longer than that to even think of getting the exclusion. So it all has a lot of pros and cons. Now, as you may all know, we're expecting an announcement in May on the new Section 232 auto investigation. So that's going to create a whole new flux of problems, because basically they're threatening duties on autos and auto parts from multiple different countries, in fact, all countries. And that could have an even more debilitating effect on the U.S. economy and U.S. trade with the rest of the world. Section 301, I'm going to go over briefly. Effectively, there were 3 rounds. The first round had 25% duties and went into effect on July 6th. The second round went into effect on August 23rd of last year and had 25% duties, and lost the slide. Third round had went into effect on September 23rd and had a 10% duties on all of those products. The round 3 had the largest economic impact because it covered over $200 billion of goods from China. And this is the one where recently we're supposed to have a new product exclusion process, but more importantly, this is the round that triggered the increase, or kind of the faster pace of U.S.-China negotiations. Now, what's the status of that? Well, there's no give on either side. We keep hearing rumors that there's going to be a settlement fairly soon, and we're hoping that at least by May or June that this 301 duties are mitigated or removed in some manner. But it's a watch and wait. So with all of these trade remedies out there, what can businesses do? Well, the most important thing is that you have to be prepared for all of this increased enforcement on the U.S. side. You have to be aware that your competitors could file e-allegations, which means that basically they don't have to reveal what's happening, they just have to say, hey, I think company A is doing something wrong. Well, Customs is going to investigate that, which means that if you are company A, you're going to be caught up in this investigatory process with Customs that's going to tie you up into a lot of different knots if your documentation and everything is not maintained correctly. There's also an increased enforcement under what is known as the Enforce and Protect Act, or EPA, which means if you have companies that are importing goods subject to anti-dumping or countervailing duties, well, if there's any type of shift in the trade pattern or potentially some issue associated with classification, well, Customs is increasingly using the EPA statute as a means to investigate the potential for the evasion of anti-dumping or countervailing duties. And that is becoming more and more kind of a stick used by Customs to make sure that everybody is reporting their entries at the time of entry accurately and paying all of the correct duties. There are also False Claim Act claims, as well as a lot of actions by Customs associated with valuation concerns and other duty mitigation concerns. So you should also be aware of increased unfair trade actions. And this includes things under the Anti-Dumping and Countervailing Duty Trade Law, Section 337, Section 301. So every one of these statutory provisions which offer some sort of a remedy to limit or at least create trouble for importers, well, the U.S. government is using that. Thus, if you're an importer or if you're an exporter, your awareness level has to be higher in order to be able to counter these actions with a planned strategy. Doing it on an ad hoc basis is not going to get you the win that you want. You need to have this very strategic approach on how to attack this. And again, with the unfair trade actions and all of these actions, you want to be mindful of shifting supply chains, which means, for example, Chinese businesses setting operations in other Asian countries. Well, if you see that happening or you're approached for that to happen, you want to monitor the investment approach that's being used. You want to monitor what the ownership and management structures are, the sourcing and source of inputs and raw materials for country of origin concerns. And you also want to see what the incentives that these smaller countries are giving for this influx of infrastructure and other investment that's occurring. We recently had a case called glycine from Thailand, where we had a Chinese-owned glycine producer with operations in Thailand. Well, we helped them get zero rates and no particular market situation analysis, because we were able to advise them through all of these kind of hierarchical analyses prior to the anti-dumping and countervailing duty case being filed, such that we knew going in everything that we were going to deal with. So another topic that's of interest if you're facing these duties is, what happens if you're using Chinese imports to make your goods? Well, the U.S. industries and the government is really on high alert for country of origin issues and tariff heading issues. So you need to make sure that if you're purchasing something or you're planning on shipping to the U.S., it's not just a good that's transshipped through another country, because merely transshipping and changing the country of origin is considered a criminal act under the U.S. statute. So everyone's heard of Huawei. Well, that same approach is being applied to even, all these small consumer goods and, steel and aluminum products. So it has to be country of origin and where your source of raw materials or source of the finished good is a very important factor to look at. And there are risks involved if you're involved buying from a company that merely wants to transship, because ultimately it's the importer in the U.S. that is held liable for all of these kind of machinations, for lack of a better term. Now, why is country of origin so important? Well, under the U.S. statute, that's kind of the clearest and easiest way for customs to trigger and find out what's going wrong. And so they're going to apply a test called substantial transformation, which means that unless you're making an entirely new product, country of origin remains the country from which the inputs came from. And this is a case-by-case analysis. So if anyone is facing this issue, you want to seek advice from somebody who knows this area of law before you do anything, because you don't want to pay the price by not, cross-checking everything. Some of the penalties for false country of origin are both criminal as well as, civil. So it's a very important factor to take a look at. So I know we can go for hours on this, but this presentation has come to an end, and I really appreciate all the time that everyone has taken to attend this webinar today. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Yes, thank you for the wonderful presentation. So if you have any questions, You can now type in your question, and she will answer your question one by one. So you can start typing in your question to the chat box. Do you have guys any question, or are we all good? Okay, so I guess the presentation has been explained well. That's why, well, let's see, there are some people typing in. So let's just wait. Oh, you're welcome. So let's see, let's just wait for a few minutes. Yes, I guess everyone is very satisfied with the detailed presentation. Oh, there's one.
No, it's
Okay, go
just
ahead.
thank
Yeah.
you.
Oh, later. Okay.
Thank you,
Okay.
Ron.
Well, yes. Anyway, just to let you know, guys, we will send the if we will send the slides for this presentation for your reference, and then for any question, you can go to our website. Just go to our International Trade Council. You can search Google for that. And I think that's all for today. Thank you so much for the detailed presentation. It's very nice and very informative. And you all have a wonderful day. I hope we have some webinar again in the future. Thank you, Nithya.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye bye.